Okay, let's get started, shall we? And let's see, I think I already assigned to you the material for this week, Bacon and Hobbes in the reading and an outlining of Hobbes. This afternoon, I want us to focus on Bacon, and if we have time, some introductory things regarding Hobbes. But to introduce this, let me start with a reminder of what we were saying last time. That is to say that the history of modern philosophy can be schematized in terms of the intersection of two lines of thought. On the one hand, in British philosophy, an empiricist tradition, and on the other hand, in continental, a rationalist tradition. These two traditions representing the extension into all areas of inquiry of the inductive methods of science that were being proposed, and on the other hand, the deductive mathematical type of method which Descartes is going to propose. So what we'll be doing is tracing the development of these two streams, and starting in the British stream with Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes, 17th century England. Francis Bacon, first of all, some orientation to his purpose and method. His overall purpose is very apparent in his writings and in much of the secondary literature about Bacon, but it frequently does not come out in the one-chapter treatments that you get in textbooks like Stumpf. It is, however, particularly interesting if we're trying to trace the shift of worldviews from medieval to modern times. Inasmuch as Bacon, while every bit as genuinely Christian as the medievals, comes at the whole undertaking in a markedly different way. Bacon's mother was a Puritan of Reformed theological persuasion, and there are echoes of that in Bacon's thinking and in his overall purpose. He makes repeated reference to the so-called cultural mandate in the opening chapters of Genesis. The mandate given to Adam and Eve to replenish, subdue, exercise dominion, stewardship, so forth. And he complains that the human race, far from fulfilling that mandate, is detracted from it, and that it is the responsibility that we have to recover the exercise of that right over nature which belongs to the human race by divine bequest. So he's thinking, as Reformed thinkers often do, of the task of philosophy, science, the intellect, in terms of creation, sin, redemption. Creation gave us a mandate. Sin has distracted us from the mandate. Redemption calls us back. Now, that's the theological frame with which he's working. But the particular kind of sins that he blames and the particular redemptive hope that he has is tied very much to philosophy. That is to say, he regards the scholastics as some of the main perpetrators of the crime of distracting the human race from the cultural mandate. For the reason that the scholastic disputes help us not at all in enriching human life, in transforming society through human knowledge, and so forth. And on the contrary, what he wants, instead of the sterility of Aristotelian philosophy, as he calls it, the sterility that disgusts him, what he wants is a new approach, a new method, that will help us get back to the task of transforming nature and shaping human society. I'll put it this way, if you like. The medievals conceived of philosophy as ancilla theologiae. That is to say, as the servant, ancillary to, servant of theology. Philosophy serving theological tasks. What Bacon does is to see philosophy not as the ancilla, the servant of theology, but of society, working for the good of the human condition, you see, trying to change the world in which we live. And he's very explicit that the ideal that he has is a kind of utopian ideal. Indeed, the late 16th century, the Elizabethan age, was the age of utopias. You see, it was the age of utopias. And Bacon himself wrote about a scientific utopia that he was dreaming of. A utopia, that is to say, that is brought in by applying scientific knowledge of nature's processes, to the transformation of conditions. And it is that transformed society for which he sees everyone working, which he speaks of as the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. So it's sort of a religiously motivated utopian ideal, characteristic of the Renaissance, but one that sees the hope implemented by modern science, you see, by modern science. Now, let's not jump to the conclusion that he's thinking that human knowledge automatically produces good results. He makes some ethical comments along the way. And it's very evident that while, as he puts it, knowledge is power, and that's his famous dictum, knowledge is power, he wants that power controlled by an appropriate ethic. And without the natural law ethic rooted in the scholastic tradition, you see, he doesn't have a metaphysical basis for an ethic. And so the ethic has to be one that comes from, in his words, true religion and right reason, which sounds just like William of Ockham. True religion, the divine commands. Right reason, the prudence that comes out of being aware of consequences. True religion and right reason. Now, if you have with you the anthology, and I'd like to assume you do, this is the new anthology, beginning with Bacon. Oh, you mean you didn't bring it? Okay, next time. Okay, some of you, I see, brave souls, have used copies with you, and others have new copies with you. Bring it anyway, we're going to need it, the whole thing. On page 20, oops, I brought the wrong one. The old one, let me borrow, may I, today, I'll borrow yours. I spoke in a mirror. All right, at the very end of the Bacon selection, the very end on page 20, this is what he says. It will not be amiss to distinguish three kinds, as it were, grades of ambition in mankind. The first is of those who desire to extend their own power in their native country. And that's the self-interested kind, which kind is vulgar and degenerate. So he's no ethical egoist. The second is of those who labour to extend the power of their country and its dominion among men. Now, this certainly has more dignity, though no less covetousness. It's corporate egoism. Interesting for a writer in the age of Elizabeth, if you know English history, you see. But if a man endeavour to establish and extend the power and dominion of the human race itself over the universe, his ambition, if ambition it may be called, is without doubt both more wholesome thing and more noble than the other two. And that power of the human race over the universe, that's the dominion over the creation. You see. So that is Bacon's motive. And you may well have come across literature or heard it said that this Baconian emphasis really gave license to modern science to exploit nature, to dominate resources and the environment for our own pleasure and good, so that sometimes the environmental problems of our day are blamed on Francis Bacon. You see. Now, frankly, I think that's accusing Bacon without looking at the context from which he's thinking. Because it's very apparent as you read Bacon at length that he's not thinking of it as domination, but as stewardship in a way appropriate to the kingdom of God. So it's a very significantly different thing. It's not to say that the Baconian influence didn't give people license, but it wasn't Bacon. It was the way Bacon was read out of context. Now, what sort of method does he have in mind? What sort of knowledge can give power over nature's processes? And the answer obviously has to be a knowledge of nature's processes. A knowledge of nature's processes. And the way he puts it might be misleading unless you see the subtle use of words that are involved. Because on the one hand, he has rejected any metaphysic of forms. That is to say, he's not a realist in the medieval sense of real universals. He rejects any metaphysical forms. If there are final causes, that is to say, purposes involved in nature, well, we'll have to leave that to the theologians. It's not accessible by rational means, by empirical means. So instead of a metaphysical forms, he's turning to an empirical science that aims to discover forms. And if you're not careful, you might read the second sense of forms as the same as the first sense of forms, which it is not. The second sense of form is just the uniform way in which natural processes proceed. That is to say, when A is routinely followed by B, you're getting that form of behavior in the natural processes, and he wants a method which can get at this kind of form. The form has to do with processes that are entirely due to the operation of physical forces in the material world. Physical forces in the material world. And the philosopher whom he cites most appreciatively in this regard is, as you might expect with the rise of mechanistic science, Democritus, the Greek atomist, everything understood in terms of matter and motion, though in his own time the most significant scientist undoubtedly was, of course, Galileo, who thought in similar Democritan kinds of terms. So this is his purpose. His method and empirical science of forms is what we will see gives him concern to develop appropriate inductive methods, inductive logic, rather than deductive. Let me add this footnote, that in criticizing deductive reasoning, he has little appreciation for what syllogisms can establish. The problem is not with the process of inference involved in syllogisms. The problem is not with the laws of logic. He's too wise for that. The problem is finding premises. Now, that was precisely the problem which Aristotle put his fingers on, you remember, in that long opening section of the posterior analytics. Where do we get the first principles for demonstration? Plato had said by dialectic. Aristotle poses the problem of an infinite regress of first principles, or of a circular argument about first principles, and finally comes down to the notion that we are able intuitively to abstract the first principle, the form of the species, from the experience that we have cumulatively of a whole species. Now, it's that process of intuitive abstraction which Bacon does not like. He talks in one place of improperly and hastily abstracted concepts that render syllogistic reasoning useless. Aristotle's abstraction of forms from species. He has little respect for it. Yet the interesting thing is that while Aristotle called that process induction, by induction we know the forms, Bacon also calls the process induction. By induction we know the forms. But since induction of forms in the first sense, Aristotle's sense, induction through intuitive abstraction, is inaccurate, insufficient, imprecise, he wants obviously another kind of inductive method in dealing with forms in the second sense. So watch the vocabulary. I think it's part of his literary craft, and he is really a Renaissance literary figure. But it's part of his literary craft, you see, that he speaks of forms, induction as the method of knowing the forms, which is Aristotelian language, but it's not Aristotelian concepts. He's changing the objects of knowledge changing the methods of knowing. It's knowing by the new method of this new object of knowledge that is going to give power. Knowledge by the old kind of method of the old objects of knowledge does not, he thinks, give power over nature. Okay? So what he wants then is an empirical science dealing with forces in the material world. Knowledge then is of instrumental value. He's not after truth for its own sake, understanding for its own sake. He doesn't see the road to truth as the ladder to the contemplation of God, as the medievals did. He does not see the road to truth as the way to the contemplation of God. Contemplating the forms, rising to the contemplation of the form of all forms, the good, you see. No, that's not his hierarchy of being. It's not his worldview. He sees God as creator, but our responsibility in nature is this creation mandate to dominion for the sake of the kingdom of God. Now, if you can hold that line of thought in mind, let me add one other piece of historical context that looks further forward. There are really just 2 or 3 key themes associated with Bacon that we need to get a hold of. One certainly is his conception of induction. The second is that knowledge is power in relationship to power over nature, creation mandate. But the third is the assumption that this kind of scientific knowledge can be entirely objective. The idea that scientific knowledge can be entirely objective. The idea that science tells us about reality. Not realism about universals, but realism about scientific knowledge. And this emphasis is what he transmits to the Enlightenment, that comes out most forcibly, most influentially in the Scottish realism of the next century, the 18th century, in which connection reference is constantly made, both in people like Thomas Reid, the Scottish realist, we'll meet him later on, and in recent writings about Scottish realism, because that's been going through a revival of interest over the last 10 years. Among the people who've revived interest in it is Mark Knoll, through his research and writing on American intellectual history. But the constant reference in connection with Scottish realism is to the Baconian view of science. Baconian science. Meaning, science that's completely objective, science which is purely empirical, science which has no presuppositions, you see. Science which is the same for anybody, Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, complete naturalist, you see. Objective, empirical science telling us, as it tells anybody, about the realities of nature. Okay. Now, the result in that Scottish realist tradition was that it came to be believed that modern science gave us a firm foundation of common knowledge on the basis of which a culture can develop its own superstructure, on the basis of which there can be developed philosophical theology, apologetics, and so on and so forth. And for some of you interested in theology, apologetics, the influence of it came particularly to this country at Princeton, through Witherspoon when he came to be president of Princeton College, so that Princeton College, Princeton Seminary, the two, became the conduit into American thought of Scottish realism. The classic Presbyterian theologian of the 1860s, Charles Hodge, really approaches his whole theology on a Baconian basis, taking it that science tells us the realities, and on that basis we can argue the existence of God, you see, and human freedom and responsibility, etc., etc. And that influence very widespread, here at Wheaton included. Let's see, J. Oliver Boswell, who was the 3rd president, very definitely Scottish realist, he was philosopher, theologian, wrote extensively on Scottish realism, and had quite an influence in that regard. When I was an undergraduate here, I was introduced to philosophy in terms of Scottish realism. Not because I studied under the 3rd president, though I studied under a man who had studied under the 3rd president, when he taught elsewhere after the University. So, that Baconian influence in Scottish realism has influenced the American evangelical thought. Now I think it is much less influential distinctively among evangelicals unless you go to Asbury College and Seminary, where it is the dominating philosophical mood. The revival of Scottish realism is more in contemporary American epistemology, interestingly. Much more widespread than it used to be. Okay, so 3 things then about Bacon to keep in mind. Okay, one is inductive method, seeking to know